Steve Mccabe.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to begin by being clear about what Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary for West Midlands Police, Wendy Williams, said about the force in her most recent report. She believes it's exceptionally well prepared to face future financial challenges. It has robust management of its current demand, its finances and its plans for change. The force has embarked on an impressive 5-year change programme to transform how it intends to deliver policing, and in last year's Valuing the Police programme, which considered how forces met the challenge of the first spending review, West Midlands Police was judged to be outstanding. I want to thank the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner David Jamieson, our former Chief Constable Chris Sims and our new Chief Constable Dave Thompson for doing such a good job on our behalf. The Government, Madam Deputy Speaker, has suggested that West Midlands Labour MPs are wrong to complain that our police are being shortchanged. The Minister thinks West Midlands Police are squirreling away money and sitting on huge reserves. Let's look at the reserves of the largest force in England and Wales outside the Met. Not only does it serve a population of nearly 3 million people and an area of some 348 square miles, but as HMIC note, the area served by the West Midlands Force faces the most significant challenge of terrorism and extremism outside London, a point which I think the Honourable Gentleman for Kingston and Surbiton was alluding to. The force is in fact a national lead in the delivery of counter-terrorism. It complies with the requirement to hold a general reserve, which in its case is about £12 million, which I understand can be compared with figures of around 26 and 23 million for the Met and West Yorkshire Police. Of its remaining reserves, about 10 million is set aside to address redundancy and equal pay in a force still suffering the fallout from the A19 forced retirements. A further 12 million is set aside for the self-funded insurance reserve. I expect the Minister is familiar with the problems of insurance for police vehicles and how most forces hold a reserve to cover this. About 3 million is set aside for uniform and protective equipment reserve. Not high for the second largest force in the country. About 2.1 million for the Major Incident Reserve and about 18 million for the Capital Reserve. The Minister will be aware that his officials advised that forces should prepare for a reduction in capital grant in this year's settlement. I understand the West Midlands capital grant is now about 2.9 million, a cut of about 2 million on previous years. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I look at it, I, like Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, see a force with robust management of demand and finances, and one that's proved outstanding in facing up to the challenges which austerity has imposed on it. It's quite misleading for anyone to suggest that they are sitting on massive reserves, and I invite the Minister to look again at these figures before anyone in the Government is tempted to repeat such a charge. On the question of the formula, I wonder if I can invite the Minister to clear up the situation with regards to claims from the Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Northamptonshire that he's been led to expect a transfer of funding from urban forces like the West Midlands to rural forces like his. Last week, the Home Secretary didn't feel able to tell my honourable friend from Birmingham Northfield that she wasn't planning such a transfer of funds. Would the Minister like to take this opportunity to come clean about his intentions?
On the gentleman to give way, and of course he is quoting the figures which I actually helped supply to him, so I'm not going to contradict the figures interpretation. I will during the course of my summing up. There is no funding formula change on the books, so nobody can say that they're going to be better or worse off until we come forward with the formula.
It's certainly true that the Minister did give me a glimpse of some of the figures, and I'm extremely grateful to him for that. Let me just reiterate the point. What the Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner said was that he'd been tipped off that there would be a transfer of funds from urban to rural forces. That's the point I was making. And what my constituents want to know, Mr Deputy Speaker, is why is it do we need more money to police Surrey and Northamptonshire than we need to police a place like the West Midlands? That's what we need to know. Why do we need to have less while they get more? And I was interested. Yes, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. He may all look to ask the same question of the local government formula, where Surrey has actually got more money than, for example, deprived areas like Durham and his area. And I think what the suspicion is again that this funding formula will be used to divert money away from Labour areas to Conservative areas.
Well, I have to say, if we look at past forum, that certainly seems to be the implication. I was very interested to hear the honourable gentleman for South Dorset earlier implore the Minister to think again about fair funding on the basis that with a fairer funding arrangement, the force in Dorset would get an extra £1 million per year. Can I just remind the Minister, with the same fairer funding formula, West Midlands would get an extra £40 million per year. So when it comes to the transfer of resources, I hope he'll bear that in mind. Because the reality is, far from getting extra funding, over the past 5 years, our force has had to contend with £180 million of cuts, the highest in the country. The workforce has been reduced by 3,000. The incoming Chief Constable has been clear that they will need to reorganise to cope with the gaps. Gaps, Mr Deputy Speaker. His words, with the gaps they now have to carry. I'd like to know how he's meant to plug these gaps. The mistakes in the formula mean that they're now planning, as we've heard earlier, against a 1 year rather than a 4-year profile. That's going to make that a much more difficult challenge for them. So I'd like to know how the Minister thinks the Chief Constable of the West Midlands is going to plug these gaps. Now, I want to be clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't want to deride the Home Secretary for saying that volunteers with specialist skills in IT or accountancy might be useful in helping to tackle cybercrime. But I'm curious to know why it's necessary to create a new position of police support volunteers rather than simply recruit more special constables with particular skills and expertise. Is this part of a wider volunteer plan? I'll certainly give way.
Very, very simple answer, Mr Deputy Speaker. A special constable is an unpaid, warranted officer, the same as a full-time officer. Many people do not want to carry the warrant, but do want to help the local police force. That's why there's a separate criteria, and they're not all specials because they'll all have to be warranted.
Well, I'm grateful to the Minister for that, and perhaps he'll show us the consultation that took place to show the support for this new police support volunteer role. I'd welcome having a look at that, so I am grateful to him for that. I want to ask him, going back to funding for a second, if he really considers it a triumph for his honourable friends from Solihull and Dudley South to claim credit for a 4.6% rise in the police precept paid by the taxpayers of the West Midlands to make up for the money being given to places like Surrey and Northamptonshire. Is that how we're going to be forced to plug the gap, by paying more pounds for less police in our area? Mr Deputy Speaker, we're also repeatedly advised that crime has fallen and therefore by implication that the government's cuts are justified. I assume the Minister doesn't dispute the claims of the Office of National Statistics that crime rose by 6% nationally for the year ending September 2015, that violence against the person rose by 13%. I don't dispute that some types of crime have fallen, but then I'm not interested in trying to manipulate the figures to mislead anyone. Isn't it important that the government gives a full picture and comes clean on what the figures actually mean? I'll give way.
Thank you. Will you remember concede that the report in fact said that there have been an increase in the way that crime is recorded, and that the reporting and recording of crime has improved much, and that actually is an explanation for some of the rise that's been seen?
Well, I concede that what the report actually said, that certain types of sexual offences were being reported differently, and that accounted for that. But it did also quite clearly point out that violence against the person had risen by 13%, and I hope the honourable gentleman would accept that. As I say, what I think we need is clarity on these figures, rather than use them to try and paint a particular picture which may be misleading. There's one more point I'd like to make, Mr Deputy Speaker. As I indicated earlier, the West Midlands Force faces the most significant challenge of terrorism and extremism outside London. And of course, recently we've suffered a spate of gun crime in parts of Birmingham. The Chief Constable is set to increase the number of armed officers, which I understand is in line with Home Office advice. Currently, West Midlands has about 260 armed officers. An uplift in line with Home Office thinking means around a further 130 officers. Where will the funding for these additional armed police officers come from? And where will the personnel come from? Will the force be expected to recruit additional officers, or does this mean that those already engaged in neighbourhood policing or response policing will be required to transfer to these new duties, further depleting those available for existing police tasks? Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not bluff and bluster we need today. It's honest answers to legitimate questions and queries from people like myself who are genuinely worried that the formula, the funding and the rhetoric doesn't match the heroic efforts of West Midlands Police to meet the demands of the community they seek to serve.
Patricia Gibb.